The night I broke down in my car, I was convinced my life had finally reached the point where there was nowhere left to fall. I sat alone in the parking lot of a grocery store just 10 miles from home, staring at an email on my phone while rain tapped softly against the windshield. The words on the screen blurred together as tears filled my eyes. After 11 years with the company, my position had been eliminated. Just like that. No warning that mattered. No miracle at the last minute. No second chance. I lowered the phone into my lap and looked out at the rows of cars illuminated by yellow parking lot lights. People pushed shopping carts toward their vehicles. Families loaded bags into trunks. Life continued moving around me as if nothing had happened. But inside that small sedan, my entire world felt like it had stopped. My name is Emily Carter. I was 34 years old, married to a good man named Daniel, and the mother of an 8-year-old girl named Lily. From the outside, our life probably looked ordinary. We owned a modest home in Ohio. We paid our bills. We attended school events and neighborhood cookouts. We worried about the same things everyone worried about. But what most people didn't know was that we had been struggling for months. Daniel's hours at work had been reduced earlier that year. Grocery prices seemed to rise every week. Our savings account had slowly shrunk until checking the balance became something I dreaded. Losing my job wasn't just disappointing. It felt like the final piece holding everything together had suddenly disappeared. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes. For a long moment, I allowed myself to feel everything I had been trying to suppress for months. The fear. The exhaustion. The constant pressure of pretending everything was fine. I thought about Lily asking if we could still afford summer camp. I thought about Daniel sitting at the kitchen table late at night reviewing bills. I thought about the mortgage payment due in 2 weeks. My chest tightened. Then my phone buzzed. At first I ignored it. I assumed it was another automated message or a reminder about a payment. But it buzzed again. And then a third time. Finally, I glanced down at the screen. The name that appeared there made me freeze. Margaret Carter. My mother-in-law. Of all the people who could have called me in that moment, she was the last one I wanted to hear from. That probably sounds terrible. But for nearly 10 years, I had convinced myself that Margaret didn't like me. Every family dinner felt like a test I could never quite pass. Every suggestion she offered sounded like criticism. Every compliment seemed forced. At least, that's how I interpreted it. I had spent years believing she quietly regretted the day her son married me. So seeing her name on my screen while I sat crying in a grocery store parking lot felt almost unreal. I considered letting the call go to voicemail. Then it rang again. Something made me answer. I cleared my throat, wiped my eyes, and tried to sound normal. Hello? There was a brief pause before her familiar voice came through the speaker. Emily, she said softly, I've been thinking about you all day. Are you okay? For a moment, I couldn't speak. Because after everything that had happened that day, after all the fear and embarrassment and uncertainty, those were the first words anyone had asked me. And I had no idea that simple question was about to change the course of our family forever. After I ended the call, I sat in my car for several more minutes, staring through the rain-speckled windshield while Margaret's words echoed in my mind. She had not asked intrusive questions. She had not offered unwanted advice. She had simply listened. Somehow that made everything harder. I had spent years building a picture of her in my head, and that picture did not match the woman who had just called to check on me. The drive home felt longer than usual. Streetlights blurred past as dusk settled over the neighborhood. When I finally pulled into our driveway, I noticed the front porch light was already on. Daniel always turned it on before dark. It was one of those small habits that made a house feel like home. I sat in the car for another moment before gathering the courage to go inside. The moment I opened the front door, I heard Lily laughing somewhere. Upstairs. The sound stopped me in my tracks. Children have a way of continuing forward even when the adults around them feel stuck. I hung my coat in the hallway and found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. Utility bills. Insurance statements. A mortgage payment notice. The familiar collection of worries that had become permanent residents in our home. He looked up and immediately knew something was wrong. "How did it go?" he asked quietly. I lowered myself into the chair across from him and stared at the wood grain of the table. "I lost the job." The words sounded strangely flat once they were spoken aloud. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Not because he was angry. Not because he blamed me. It was the look of someone carrying more weight than he knew how to handle. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed softly in the corner. Rain tapped against the kitchen window. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet everything felt different now. "We will figure it out," Daniel finally said. It was the same thing he always said whenever life became difficult. Usually I believed him. That night I was not so sure. Later, after Lily had gone to bed, I stood alone in the laundry room folding clothes. It gave my hand something to do. A small task. A simple task. Something that still made sense. As I matched socks and folded towels, memories surfaced one after another. Family dinners at Margaret's house. Thanksgiving gatherings. Birthday parties. Little moments I had replayed countless times over the years. I remembered bringing a homemade pie to Thanksgiving and feeling embarrassed when Margaret suggested warming it before serving. At the time I thought she was criticizing my cooking. Looking back, I wondered if she had simply wanted it to taste better. I remembered Lily's first school concert when Margaret offered to help with transportation. I had declined because I assumed she thought I could not handle it myself. What if that had never been her intention? What if I had been translating everything through a lens of insecurity and assumption? The thought unsettled me. Around 10 o'clock, I checked my phone before going to bed. There was a new text message waiting. It was from Margaret. The message was short. "I am thinking about you. Please remember that you are not carrying this alone." I read the words twice. Then a third time. No judgment. No hidden message. No criticism disguised as concern. Just kindness. I placed the phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling in the darkness. For years I had convinced myself that Margaret Carter was waiting for me to fail. Yet when failure finally arrived, she seemed to be the only person who had noticed how frightened I truly was. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether I had misunderstood her all along. The following week felt like a slow-moving storm that refused to pass. Every morning I woke up with the same heavy feeling in my chest. For the first few seconds, before my mind fully caught up with reality, I would forget what had happened. Then I would remember. The job was gone. The savings account was shrinking. And every day that passed without a solution seemed to make the future feel a little less certain. I spent hours updating my resume, filling out applications, and searching through job listings online. Some positions paid far less than my previous role. Others required qualifications I did not have. I tried to stay optimistic, but rejection emails began arriving almost immediately. Each one was polite. Each one was professional. And each one felt like another door quietly closing. Meanwhile, Daniel was carrying his own burden. I noticed the changes in him before he said anything. He slept less. He stared at spreadsheets longer. He smiled less often when Lily told stories about school. One evening I found him sitting alone on the back porch after dinner. The summer air was warm, and the neighborhood was unusually quiet. He was staring out toward the fence line as if answers might suddenly appear there. I sat beside him without speaking. After a minute, he sighed. "I keep thinking I should be fixing this somehow." His voice sounded tired. "I am supposed to take care of my family." I reached for his hand. "We are both trying." He nodded, but I could tell he did not fully believe it. Financial stress has a way of turning capable people into harsh judges of themselves. A few days later, another unexpected message arrived from Margaret. She invited us to Sunday dinner. Normally I would have searched for reasons to decline. For years I had viewed invitations from her as obligations rather than opportunities. But this time felt different. Daniel encouraged me to go. It might be good for all of us, he said. So that Sunday afternoon we drove to Margaret's house. It was a familiar place. A white 2-story home on a quiet street lined with maple trees. She had lived there for more than 30 years. The flower beds were neatly maintained, and the same wind chimes still hung near the front porch. Lily ran ahead toward the door while Daniel carried a pie we had purchased from a local bakery. As soon as Margaret opened the door, Lily wrapped her arms around her grandmother. Margaret laughed and hugged her tightly. Watching them together, I noticed something I had overlooked countless times before. Lily never seemed nervous around Margaret. She never seemed guarded. Children often see people more clearly than adults do. Dinner was simple. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and homemade rolls. Nothing fancy. Just comfort food served around a table that had welcomed family members for decades. Throughout the meal, Margaret never once asked about my job search. She never mentioned money. She never offered unsolicited advice. Instead, she asked Lily about school, listened to Daniel talk about a project at work, and told a funny story about getting lost during a road trip years ago. The atmosphere felt easy. Unforced. Comfortable. At one point I found myself laughing. A real laugh. The kind I had not heard from myself in weeks. Later, while helping clear the dishes, I glanced across the kitchen and saw Margaret quietly placing leftovers into containers for us to take home. She did it casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No speech. No attention drawn to it. Just quiet generosity. And standing there beside the sink, I felt something shift inside me. Not completely. Not all at once. But enough to make me question years of assumptions. Because the woman I had spent nearly a decade keeping at arm's length was beginning to look very different from the person I thought I knew. The days following that dinner passed with a quiet rhythm that felt unfamiliar. The problems in our lives had not disappeared. The bills were still waiting on the kitchen counter. My inbox still filled with rejection emails. Daniel still carried the weight of uncertainty every time he left for work. Yet something had changed. For the first time in months, I no longer felt as though we were facing everything alone. One Tuesday afternoon I was sitting at the dining room table reviewing job listings when my phone rang. It was Margaret. I almost smiled when I saw her name. That realization surprised me. Not long ago, seeing her name would have filled me with tension. Now it simply felt comforting. After a brief greeting, she asked how the job search was going. I admitted that progress had been slow. There was a pause. Then she said something unexpected. I know someone who works at the Regional Hospital Administration Office. They may be looking for someone with your experience. Would you like me to make a call? I stared at the phone for a moment. Pride immediately rose inside me. The same pride that had kept me from accepting help so many times before. But exhaustion has a way of making honesty easier. Yes, I said quietly. I would appreciate that. Her response came without hesitation. Good. Then let me help. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my chair. The sunlight coming through the window stretched across the hardwood floor. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet I found myself thinking about all the years I had spent assuming Margaret wanted to interfere in our lives. What if she had simply wanted to support us? What if I had mistaken concern for control? A few days later, Lily came home from school carrying a family tree project. Construction paper, markers, photographs, and handwritten notes quickly took over the kitchen table. Daniel helped her organize pictures while I searched through old albums. When Lily reached Margaret's photo, she smiled. Grandma Margaret always knows how to fix things. The comment seemed innocent. Children often say things without realizing their significance. But her words stayed with me. Later that evening, I asked what she meant. Lily shrugged. Whenever someone is sad, she knows what to say. Whenever something breaks, she knows what to do. Then she returned to coloring without another thought. I looked across the room at Daniel. He smiled softly. She has always been that way. Always. The word lingered in my mind. That night I could not stop thinking about it. I began remembering moments differently. Small details I had overlooked. Times when Margaret had quietly stepped in during difficult situations. When Lily was born and we were exhausted new parents, Margaret delivered meals twice a week for nearly a month. When Daniel was recovering from a minor surgery years earlier, she drove 40 minutes every Saturday to help around the house. She never made announcements about her generosity. She never kept score. She simply showed up. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped seeing those things clearly. Perhaps because accepting kindness sometimes requires vulnerability. And vulnerability had never come easily to me. The following Friday afternoon, another message arrived from Margaret. She had spoken with her contact at the hospital. There might be an opening soon. She told me not to get my hopes up too high, but she wanted me to know that someone was willing to look at my application personally. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I had nearly forgotten. Hope. It was small. Fragile. But it was there. As I placed my phone down on the table, I realized that Margaret was slowly changing more than our circumstances. She was changing the story I had told myself about our family for nearly a decade. And deep down, I was beginning to suspect that the biggest misunderstanding in our relationship had never belonged to her. It had belonged to me. 2 weeks later, I received an email inviting me to interview for the position at the Regional Hospital Administration Office. I read the message 3 times before I allowed myself to believe it was real. The opportunity was not guaranteed, but after weeks of silence and rejection, it felt like a door had finally opened a few inches. Daniel was the first person I told. The relief on his face was impossible to miss. For months we had both been trying to stay strong for each other, but worry leaves traces. It settles into the way people speak, the way they move through a room, the way they stare at bills after everyone else has gone to bed. That evening, for the first time in a long while, we sat together on the couch without discussing money. We simply watched a movie with Lily curled up between us. It felt normal. It felt peaceful. A few days before the interview, Margaret called and asked if I would like to stop by for coffee. There was a time when I would have politely declined. Instead, I found myself saying yes without hesitation. Her house was quiet when I arrived. Soft afternoon sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows. A kettle whistled on the stove, and the familiar scent of fresh coffee filled the room. We sat at the small wooden table where countless family conversations had taken place over the years. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The weather. Lily's school project. A neighbor who had recently adopted a puppy. Then the conversation slowed. Margaret stirred her coffee and looked down into the cup for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual. "Emily, can I tell you something?" I nodded. She folded her hands together on the table. When Daniel was 10 years old, his father lost his job. I listened quietly. Over the next several minutes, she shared a story I had never heard before. Her husband had spent nearly 8 months searching for work. Their savings had nearly disappeared. They worried constantly about keeping their home. There were nights when she stayed awake wondering how they would pay for groceries the following week. She described the fear with such honesty that I immediately recognized it. It was the same fear that had been living in our house. "We got through it," she said. But I remember how lonely it felt. People offered advice. People offered opinions. Very few people offered understanding. She smiled faintly. I promised myself that if someone I loved ever faced that kind of struggle, I would try to be the person I needed back then. I stared at her for a moment. Suddenly many things began making sense. Her patience. Her calm. Her refusal to judge. She understood because she had lived through it herself. The realization touched something deep inside me. For years I had viewed her as someone standing outside my life looking in. Now I saw her differently. She was not observing from a distance. She recognized the road because she had already walked it. Before I left that afternoon, she handed me a small folder. Inside were interview tips, notes she had gathered from her contact at the hospital, and a handwritten list of encouraging reminders. Nothing complicated. Nothing dramatic. Just practical help offered with genuine care. As I drove home, the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because our problems had disappeared. Not because the future was suddenly guaranteed. But because I finally understood something important. Strength does not always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carrying a cup of coffee, sharing an old story, and reminding you that difficult seasons do not last forever. And somewhere between that conversation and the drive home, I realized I was no longer seeing Margaret as my mother-in-law. I was beginning to see her as family in the deepest sense of the word. The interview took place on a bright Monday morning. I arrived 30 minutes early, clutching the folder Margaret had given me as though it contained something more valuable than paper. In many ways, it did. It contained confidence. Encouragement. Proof that someone believed in me at a time when I was struggling to believe in myself. The hospital administration building stood 4 stories tall, with large glass windows reflecting the morning sun. As I walked through the entrance, I felt the familiar flutter of nervousness in my stomach. But this time it was different. I was afraid, yes, but I was also prepared. The interview lasted nearly an hour. We discussed my experience, my previous responsibilities, and how I handled challenges. 4. The first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. Not the unemployed woman sitting at home refreshing job listings. Not the worried mother staring at bills. Just Emily. Capable. Experienced. Valuable. When I returned home that afternoon, Daniel was waiting in the kitchen. The hopeful look on his face made me smile before I even spoke. I think it went well, I said. His shoulders relaxed immediately. We both knew that did not guarantee anything, but it felt like progress. Real progress. That evening, Lily spread her homework across the dining room table while I prepared dinner. The house felt lighter. Not because our problems had disappeared, but because hope had finally entered the room again. A few days later, Margaret invited us over for dinner once more. This time, I noticed things I had never paid attention to before. The framed family photographs lining her hallway. The handwritten birthday card she had saved for years. The little notes Lily had drawn for her taped to the refrigerator. Everywhere I looked, there was evidence of someone who cherished her family deeply. After dinner, while Daniel and Lily played a board game in the living room, Margaret and I remained at the table talking. The conversation drifted naturally from one topic to another until she suddenly stood and disappeared upstairs. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a small photo album. She placed it gently on the table between us. "I thought you might enjoy seeing these," she said. Inside were photographs from years before I entered the family. Daniel as a little boy holding a fishing pole. Daniel riding a bicycle with scraped knees and a huge smile. Daniel standing proudly beside a science fair project. Page after page documented a mother's love. As we turned the pages together, Margaret shared stories I had never heard. Some were funny. Some were touching. Some revealed struggles she had quietly carried while raising her son. Listening to her, I realized how little I truly knew about the woman sitting across from me. I knew the role she occupied in my life. Mother-in-law. Grandmother. Widow. But I had never taken the time to understand the person behind those titles. At one point, she pointed to an old photograph of herself standing beside her late husband. They looked young and hopeful. "Life rarely goes the way we expect," she said softly. "But sometimes the people who help us through the difficult chapters become the greatest blessings." I glanced at her and saw tears gathering in her eyes, though she quickly smiled and looked away. In that moment, something settled inside me. The walls I had spent years building were finally coming down. Not because she demanded it. Not because she forced it. But because kindness has a quiet way of reaching places that arguments never can. And as I sat there beside her, surrounded by photographs and memories, I began to understand that this chapter of our lives was changing far more than our financial situation. It was changing us. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was folding laundry in the living room. The number on the screen belonged to the hospital. For a second, I simply stared at it. My heart began beating so fast that I almost let the call go to voicemail. Somehow, I managed to answer. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, I remained standing in the middle of the room holding the phone against my chest. I had been offered the position. The salary was slightly lower than my previous job, but the benefits were excellent, and there was room for advancement. More importantly, it was a fresh start. For the first time in months, I felt as though the ground beneath my feet had stopped shifting. When Daniel came home that evening, I met him at the front door before he could even take off his jacket. The smile on my face told him everything before I spoke a single word. He pulled me into a hug, and for several seconds neither of us said anything. We simply stood there, holding on to each other while the relief settled over us. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table talking quietly. The stack of unpaid bills was still there, but somehow it looked less intimidating. We were not out of the woods yet. We still had work to do. But now we had a path forward. The following Saturday, I drove to Margaret's house to share the news in person. She answered the door with her usual warm smile, and before she could say anything, I told her. Her eyes immediately filled with happiness. Not surprise. Not pride in herself. Just genuine happiness for me. She hugged me tightly and said, "I knew you could do it." We spent most of the afternoon talking. At one point, she suggested we look through a few boxes stored in the attic. They contained old family keepsakes, photographs, and letters that had not been touched in years. The attic smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight coming from a small window near the roof. While sorting through one box, I discovered a stack of carefully tied envelopes. They were letters. Some were written by Daniel when he was away at college. Others were written by Margaret's late husband. As I helped organize them, one envelope slipped free and landed on the floor. Margaret picked it up slowly. For a moment, she looked uncertain. Then she handed it to me. "You can read it if you would like," she said. The letter had been written years earlier by her husband shortly before his passing. Most of it spoke about family. About gratitude. About appreciating people while they were still present in our lives. Near the end, one sentence caught my attention. He had written that kindness often goes unnoticed at first because people are busy carrying their own burdens. But eventually, kindness leaves a trail that leads people home. I read those words twice. Then a third time. When I looked up, Margaret was quietly watching me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. We did not need to. Something about that letter seemed to capture everything I had been learning during the past several months. I thought about all the assumptions I had carried for years. All the stories I had created in my mind about who Margaret was. And I realized how often fear distorts our vision. We see rejection where there is concern. Judgment where there is wisdom. Distance where there is patience. As the afternoon sunlight faded outside the attic window, I carefully returned the letter to its envelope. Deep inside, I felt another shift take place. Not dramatic. Not Sudden. Just clear. The woman I had once struggled to understand had become one of the most important people in my life. And somehow, I knew the best chapter of our relationship had only just begun. My first month at the hospital passed faster than I expected. Each morning I left the house before sunrise with a travel mug of coffee and a growing sense of purpose. The work was challenging, but in a way that energized me rather than exhausted me. Slowly, our lives began to settle into a healthier rhythm. The constant anxiety that had once filled every corner of our home started to fade. Daniel seemed lighter. Lily laughed more. Even the house itself felt different, as though it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. One Saturday afternoon, several months after I started the new job, our family gathered at Margaret's house for a barbecue. The weather was perfect. The sky was clear, and a gentle breeze moved through the trees in her backyard. Children from neighboring homes rode bicycles along the sidewalk while the smell of grilled hamburgers drifted through the air. It was the kind of day people remember years later without fully understanding why. Everyone seemed relaxed, comfortable, present. At one point, I stood near the kitchen window watching Margaret help Lily decorate cupcakes at the dining room table. The two of them were laughing about something, completely absorbed in their own little world. I found myself smiling. Not because of anything dramatic. Just because the scene felt right. Daniel stepped beside me and followed my gaze. "She adores her grandmother," he said quietly. I nodded. "I know." After a brief silence, he looked at me. "You know, Mom always worried about you." I turned toward him. "What do you mean?" He smiled softly. "She worried that she said the wrong thing sometimes. She worried you thought she was criticizing you. She told me more than once that she wished she knew how to connect with you better." I stared at him, genuinely surprised. For years I had believed I was the only one carrying uncertainty in that relationship. The idea that Margaret had been struggling too had never crossed my mind. Later that afternoon, after most of the dishes had been cleared away, I found Margaret sitting alone on the back porch. The sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky, casting everything in warm golden light. For a moment, I simply stood there watching her. Then I walked over and sat beside her. We talked about ordinary things at first. Work. Lily's upcoming school year. Daniel's plans for a project around the house. Eventually the conversation slowed, and a comfortable silence settled between us. I looked out across the yard and realized there was something I needed to say. Something I should have said long ago. "Margaret," I began softly, "I owe you an apology." She looked at me with surprise. I took a slow breath. "For years, I thought you did not like me. I assumed things that were not true. I kept my distance when I should have been trying to understand you." Her expression softened immediately. Before I could continue, she gently shook her head. "Emily, we both made mistakes." I felt tears gathering in my eyes. Not from sadness. From relief. The kind of relief that comes when a burden you have carried for years finally slips away. I reached over and took her hand. "Thank you," I whispered. "For everything." Margaret squeezed my hand gently. Neither of us spoke for several moments. We did not need to. The silence felt full rather than empty. Peaceful rather than awkward. And as we sat there watching the evening sunlight stretch across the backyard, I realized that one of the most important relationships in my life had been rebuilt not through grand speeches or dramatic moments, but through patience, understanding, and a kindness that never asked for recognition. Nearly 2 years have passed since the afternoon I sat alone in my car convinced that everything was falling apart. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Other times it feels as though it happened only yesterday. Life has a way of moving forward quietly. Not in dramatic leaps, but in small moments that slowly become new routines. The job at the hospital turned into a position I genuinely loved. Daniel eventually received a promotion that eased much of the financial pressure we had carried for so long. Lily. grew taller, more confident, and somehow seemed to become a little wiser with each passing year. Our home once again became a place filled with laughter instead of worry. Yet when I think about everything that changed during those difficult months, I realize the most important transformation had very little to do with money or employment. It had everything to do with family. One Sunday afternoon, our entire family gathered at Margaret's house to celebrate her 70th birthday. The dining room was filled with flowers, photographs, and the sound of conversations overlapping in every corner. Friends and relatives moved from table to table sharing stories and memories. Sunlight poured through the windows, making the room feel warm and welcoming. At one point, I stepped into the kitchen to help carry out dessert. Margaret was standing at the counter arranging candles on her birthday cake. For a moment, I simply watched her. The same woman I had once misunderstood. The same woman whose kindness had quietly appeared when our lives felt darkest. The same woman who never demanded gratitude and never reminded anyone of the ways she had helped. She noticed me standing there and smiled. "Everything ready?" she asked. I smiled back. Almost. Together we carried the cake into the dining room while everyone sang. Lily stood beside her grandmother, beaming with pride. Daniel snapped photographs. The room felt full in every possible way. Full of love. Full of history. Full of people who belonged to one another. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone home, a few of us remained on the back porch enjoying the cool evening air. The sky had turned shades of orange and pink as the sun disappeared beyond the trees. Lily sat beside Margaret with her head resting on her shoulder. Daniel was telling a story that had everyone laughing. I looked around and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not because life had become perfect. No family is perfect. No life is free from challenges. But because we had learned something valuable. We had learned that assumptions can create distance where none needs to exist. We had learned that pride can prevent us from accepting the very support we need. Most importantly, we had learned that kindness often changes lives in ways that cannot be measured. As the evening grew quieter, Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand. It was a simple gesture. One she probably did not think much about. But it meant everything to me. I squeezed her hand back and smiled. No explanation was necessary. Some feelings become too deep for words. Looking back now, I understand something that I could not see during those difficult months. The hardest season of my life did not only reveal who would stand beside me. It revealed how wrong I had been about someone who cared for me all along. The woman I once kept at a distance became one of my closest friends. The family I feared was drifting apart became stronger than ever. And every time I sit around a dinner table surrounded by the people I love, I remember a simple truth. Sometimes the greatest blessings arrive from the people we least expect. Sometimes they arrive quietly. And sometimes they change everything.